Welcome to the Streets and People podcast presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. Get Around Cabo Car Free is a volunteer community movement advocating for more transport options for people who can't drive in Caboolture and Morayfield in Queensland. In today's podcast, we'll be covering one of these three broad topics. It might be Road Rules 360, where we discuss Queensland's road rules, the legislation, the design for people walking, biking, in wheelchairs or on a scooter. It might be Not Everyone Drives, where we chat with people whose transport options don't include a car in a car-dependent society. And it might be People and Projects, where our conversations are with people working on a specific aspect of inclusive transportation. Today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes, and I am extremely delighted to have Marco de Brömmelstroet, who is here with us in the studio. Marco is actually the main reason why Get Around Cabo Car Free exists. My husband bought the book, Movement, co-authored with Talia Vacard. I was so inspired by it. I started Get Around Cabo Car Free. I thought it just nailed a whole lot of ideas that had been under-formulated, that I saw that there was a problem, but I couldn't quite figure it out. And then I did some of your Urban Cycling Institute courses, which are free on your website. When I started and I met all our stakeholders at council and state and federal parliamentarians and various other peoples, I gave away a copy of that book. So I think I bought about 60 copies of your book, and I'm clearly a really huge fan. And I was very sorry when you came to Brisbane recently I didn't make the talk. So perhaps you could say where you're calling from, which city, and what made you interested in this whole urban area?
Yeah, I'm calling in from a city which is called Ede, EDE. If you want to locate it, it's smack in the middle of this tiny country of the Netherlands. We literally have the geographical center point of the Netherlands in our municipality. In the wider scheme of things, I think most of the listeners would consider that I live in Amsterdam, which is 45 minutes away by direct train connection. And I work there at the University of Amsterdam. It's quite a normal commute distance from Amsterdam. It's an interesting question to think about how you got interested in a topic, right? Because it was never planned. It sort of happened in a way. And I was indeed always from small age. I was already interested in, of course, in my time, you had SimCity on the first PCs, the game that you could play to develop cities. I played with Lego City to make my first cities. And I became interested in it at first because I was interested in the spatial development of cities. So the historical layers of how cities develop. And over time became frustrated in that teaching about that. I felt that the issue of mobility was completely lacking. This idea that cities form, but then also cause certain mobility behavior, and the other way around, that certain mobility behavior or options shape our cities, was sort of lacking. From there on, very long story short, I became fascinated by that topic, and especially, actually, the red line in my thinking always has been that I felt a lack of holistic thinking in all kinds of fields. So first in spatial planning, then when I studied mobility, I saw the same thing happening there, also missing out a lot of important variables. I studied computational science, social science, also there similar things happened, and that's still something that fascinates me, that how we think about phenomena like cities or streets or even our marriage or almost anything is always reducing the full complexity. Because we have to do that, you always are missing out things, and that's where I, as a social scientist, like to go. What are we missing? And if we understand what's missing, then what will change if we include that?
If I've understood what you're saying, you really are interested not only in the very fine details of how do I go from here to there, which obviously is really important.
Mm.
You just said before you came on air that your son was going to soccer camp this week while you were on holidays, and the two of you went there by some means. But then there's this larger context of what's the infrastructure and what's the bicycle like and what's the relationship between the two of you like. And how does he view his soccer game and his soccer team and the camp? And there's actually a whole lot of larger things in there. Does that sound what you're saying?
Unexpectedly for many listeners, the soccer camp is 10 kilometers away from here, and I'm completely car dependent of bringing him there and getting him. Because also in the Netherlands, that system that you described for a large part offers opportunities to go around in different ways, but is still very, very car dependent. I'm doing a study study now together with an English professor into what is called motonormativity, or how our societies think differently around cars than around other things. And his expectation is that in the Netherlands, this is much less problematic than in the UK. And my expectation was the other way around. And yesterday, in trying to convince him, I found that the car ownership in the Netherlands is actually significantly higher than car ownership in the UK. We have a system in which we can go from A to B. And in many cases, the bike is indeed an option. We've created that option. However, we have created that option not at the expense of the car, but alongside it, which means that the car is still this very strong force in how cities are shaped, in where soccer camps are held, where supermarkets are located, and how, for instance, primary schools are also increasingly shut down and clustered, and distances become also larger. And indeed, I'm fascinated by how this works, how these forces sort of shape the city in which we live. And one of the things that I find fascinating to talk to people about is how recently those developments are, right? Maybe, well, 2.5 generations ago, the car wasn't a factor in this. So everything that we now take for granted as where things are and how we need to get there are a very recently shaped phenomena in the history of our cities. And we now find it very difficult to see the limits of that, to see how it was shaped. And that actually, to come back to the role of Thalia Fekada, I think the book movement works really well because we start from the perspective of somebody who never questioned this. And as a journalist, started to engage with the question how to solve congestion, like everybody does, because every half an hour on all radio stations, we hear about congestion. So that has to be a big problem. And then together with her, the book follows basically this, what happens if you keep asking questions, if you keep asking them, but why is this the case? Why is Brisbane shaped as it is today? Why is it that I need a car to go from A to B? That's not a given. It's a design choice. It's a result of certain forces. And the first step is to understand that. The first step, I think, is to understand that choices were made with often the best intentions. Those choices were by definition limited. They have shaped our cities, okay? And with that step one, we can go to step two, because if we understand that, we also understand that everybody has some power to reshape it. So there's no reason to, I actually more and more while traveling in Australia also believe that I think it's almost ridiculous to have the position that the current version of these cities will exist 100 years from now. It's simply impossible. But material-wise, financially, all the costs that this poses on society, it's simply impossible that this car-based mobility system and car-based city will exist in its current form in 100 years from now. It will be radically different and probably under stress of all kinds of disaster or collapses or crisis. But in that process, maybe also partly because we reconsider what a good city is. And that's something that we can all do.
All right, so that's the utopian visionary idea. We have to stop. Obviously, you would be aware of Strong Towns and Charles Marone's work. He just ran the figures as a traffic engineer and said, this is going to be really good for you and this is going to make your town rich. And then going, oh, this is actually not going to do that. And I do know someone who is looking in my area to do exactly the same, to see how the maths adds up for building roads and just the huge cost of infrastructure, because you have to do a whole lot of stuff with that. And I think that when you are in that space, you don't realize how expensive it is because it's all free, so to speak. You know, you don't realize it's not a direct cost you're paying for. So to go from here, where we're really car dependent, certainly, I don't know about Ada, here we're on the northern outskirts of Brisbane. It's the last train station going north in the suburban area, and it's one of the most car dependent suburbs in Brisbane. How do we go from here, where we are, to what you're describing, where we can actually afford to move around by changing the systems? And some people are going to get upset. There's no two ways about that, because any change is going to be like that. What do you see as the big change or direction that we should step into?
Yeah, well, as I said, the first acknowledgement of everybody needs to be that this situation is relatively new and it has been created. So it's not a given, because that's what many people think or assume almost. They were born in the system and this is just the way that we do things. This is the culture of Australia. This is what Australians do. It's all relatively new. 2 generations ago, this wasn't possible. And then there are a number of important things, I think. Start first with the numbers. I think purely the mathematics of the system can already show that this will not last. And especially if you see that in building the system, we did not include the costs of infinite repair and maintenance. If a highway is made of concrete, steel, and asphalt, those are oil-based products that look like they will last forever, but they will not. They will, at a certain point, deteriorate. And when that happens, either sometimes through a catastrophe like a landslide, but also even if that doesn't happen, it will deteriorate. This stuff will not magically be here in 500 years from now. So the maintenance cost, the repair cost, the replacement costs are huge. So that's already one thing. But if you also include all the other costs that we know exist but are not included in the thinking, this becomes even more ridiculous, like on the environmental cost or the safety costs. I was in Brisbane and talked with a group that showed me the importance, especially after all the wildfires in Australia, the importance of the koala as an icon of nature preservation, and a lot of effort goes into saving the koala, helping the koala survive. But at the same time, the large number of koalas being hit by cars without the political willingness to lower the speed of cars at places where many koalas cross roads. That's a cost. Right? That's an actual cost that we know exists and we tend to ignore. We know that in car-dependent suburbs and in car-dependent areas that the physical, mental, and social health of especially children is deteriorating fast for many reasons, but one very key reason is their lack of autonomy. So children's lack of autonomy is another of those huge costs that will literally cost society a lot of money in the long run because their health issues will sort of stack up. So if you include all of that, it's basically increasingly clear that this cannot be infinitely sustained, but I would say it cannot even be sustained over the next 10 years. Like these costs are real. 70% of children at this point suffer mental health problems that require professional help. We know this, like 7 in 10 children have mental problems that require professional help. And there are many reasons behind that. But again, we also know that their lack of autonomy, their lack of using the street as a social place is an important factor there. So that's the second thing. Not acknowledging that, I think, is childish. You cannot close your eyes. Donella Meadows once said externalities, so the variables that we externalize that we do not include in our thinking. She called them externalities are the variables that we know that exist, but that we like to ignore. And we need to have that conversation. We cannot ignore these costs. We cannot ignore fine particles, microplastics that come from tires. We cannot ignore health problems that are caused by noise of highways. These costs are real and we need to include them. That's sort of partly going into the solution. I'm not an economic thinker. I do not like economic thinking, but within economic thinking, the only logical step towards a different future is to include these costs for the user, right? That's the capitalist idea of economics, is that if you think this is a good system, if you want to live in a car-dependent suburb, you need to pay the full costs of that choice. And you shouldn't put a large part of that cost on society. That's not fair. And that makes your choice a subsidized choice. And it makes that many more people think it's a good choice than if they would actually know and incur the costs of that choice. So that's, I think, a solution direction is let's stop subsidizing car-dependent living and car ownership and car use. But then, as you said, there will be a lot of people angry because they have been used to the fact that they could do this behavior and shift the cost to elsewhere. So they feel that they are punished or that they have to pay extra, the cash cow of society, because they are not aware of the fact that those costs were always pushed to others. I think 3 solution parts. One, we need to talk about it in that way. So we shouldn't talk about paid parking or congestion pricing. It's currently congestion subsidy. It is subsidized parking. And we need to stop that because we can no longer afford it. So what we talk about in the book, it's a lot about language. Our language can free us if we talk about things differently and if we talk about different things. What if we ask politicians in Kabul or Brisbane if they would agree with the new norm that all 8-year-olds have the right, connected to the United Nations Charter of the Rights of Children, that I think Australia also signed. So what if we would translate that directly and say 8-year-olds have the right to be autonomous? So to have autonomous mobility from A to B, and ask politicians in Brisbane if they agree or disagree with that. I think you would see a shift towards much more support than we think. And that's the final thing that I want to add here. Sorry for the long answer, but it's complex. And that's also a complex notion. It's called pluralistic ignorance. Basically what it means is that in all kinds of progressive changes, researchers found that a large majority of people actually agree. If you ask them, do you support this progressive change? Like, for instance, a smoking ban in restaurants, not so long ago, at least in the Netherlands. 80% or more are generally in favor of those changes. But if you'd ask the same people, how many other people do you think agree with you? They tend to underestimate that. And that creates a sort of societal mechanism that a large majority sees themselves as a minority and therefore shuts up because they think, I don't want to be the neighbor who complains about somebody else smoking in the restaurant, because apparently most people think it's not a problem. And I don't want to be the only one that stands up. I don't want to be that person. And all those people are not aware that they're actually representing a majority position. And I think in mobility issues, that's happening as well. Is that most people actually think that the current system, for some reason, is not working and should be improved. But most of them think that they are a minority position. That's what we found. Most parents want less cars in and around the school environment of their kids. But most of them think that they are a minority position because there's so many cars in the environment of the school. So we need to shift the conversation. We need to use different language. And one of it, I think, is the health and happiness of children, which is by and large, I think, the biggest cost of the system seen by most people. Most Australians love their cars, I've heard. And my rebuttal to that is, but I think most Australians also love their children. And there's a real trade-off between the two. If we start talking about the children, I think we will see that, especially in urban settings, there's a large majority of people that are willing to support a shift. And then the third part, we can talk about that, I think. As soon as we do that, it shouldn't be about a black and white shift. It shouldn't be about, okay, let's get rid of all the cars because cars are stupid and cycling is good. It should be about the courage and the curiosity to experiment together and say, okay, if this is the situation and if our children are currently underserved, we know that we cannot suddenly change all our cities, but what can we do? What if we would have a bike bus every Friday morning where children can experience to bike to school together? Is that okay? Is that feasible for everybody? Are people really against that? We see in many different contexts that actually most people can support that. Okay, so let's try to do that. Let's make small steps together, but everybody should acknowledge that the system is problematic and to a certain extent and cannot work on the long run. So we need to experiment. We need to find ways to, with each other, have the courage and curiosity to see, okay, what can we change? Small steps.
And that's what I think too. But we look at it and it seems huge and onerous and enormous. I don't generally talk about carbon emissions, but I did read that if we don't do something about our transport emissions, transport will be our biggest emitter by 2030. So we've got 6 years left. Everybody else is reducing, but transport, private vehicles is not one of those areas because people have these very big vehicles. Don't know if you have them quite so popular in the Netherlands, but here people drive them bigger and bigger. So how do you deal with people who are really used to this very big vehicle? They think it's really safe for children. They think it's better for the kids. They think it's better for their family. They've got stuff in the car that they need to get from one place to another. How do we say, well, maybe you can do that too, but it's true, it's a little bit harder work? Or what do you suggest is a way to get people to think about those big SUVs?
I really like to share this clip of Bike is Best. The question is, what is the best tool for the job? You don't use a sledgehammer to open a peanut. The big car has a role, I think. I also traveled in quite a big car in Australia, and for large parts of my trip, it was really, I would say, almost a necessity, but not to bring your kids to school. So again, there's a couple of things there. We should keep measuring what this does to the health of children. We know that driving kids to school by car has a lot of negative effects on children. And we know from our studies in the European context that many parents do it, not explicitly if you ask them, but if you go deeper, it's connected to the notion of good parenting. They think that they are showing that they are doing the good thing for the kids. And actually, we know for a fact that they are doing the bad thing for the kid. It's much better if the kid develops autonomy, a sense of community, sense of place, spatial awareness, all these things. Of course, also the physical health effects of going to school, at least partly by walking or cycling. And not only to school, by the way, also to basketball training and maybe even to the beach and to friends. So we need to continuously focus and find and communicate that good parenting is actually, again, is something that has shifted in the last 2 generations, but has created an almost toxic situation for our youth because they are no longer experiencing what they were experiencing. So I asked the question in Adelaide, Did you play cricket on the street in front of your house when you were a child? And most adults say yes. So I asked them, so do the kids still do that? No. So why do you think that is? Well, it's fully parked with cars. Yeah. So is it good that you give it up? And again, it's not something that you can easily change, but maybe every month, one Saturday, you remove the cars and you give the street to the kids and see what happens. So that's one part of the solution. The other part is, again, it's a bit harsher, but it's to say, okay, so if you really think that you need this big car and you need to use it for all these reasons, are you also willing to pay the full costs? And they are much higher than you currently are paying for this car. And the third thing is, again, let's not be childish. So I talked also about that. So I think in Australia, there's about 20 million cars, maybe a slightly higher number. If we want to replace all of them with electrical cars and solve the carbon problem, it's physically impossible. We do not have the material resources to build those cars. The batteries that are in those cars and the 2,000 kilos of steel that are in those cars are not growing on trees either. We have to dig them somewhere out of the ground, and all those materials are running out. So this is just not a feasible model and to build the cities or our societies of the future on. All these three things together bring us back again to, okay, so let's focus. That's one of the things I do in the Netherlands with schools that also have these problems with traffic. So let's not focus on the problems. So let's not have the discussion all the time with that person who doesn't want to leave their car. Let's have a conversation with all the parents that actually would like to come by bike. And a great example, I think, if you haven't had him on, I would really advise to contact Sam Balto from Portland, who as a teacher at primary school, physical teacher, he started the bike bus. He said, every Friday morning, I'm going to ride this fixed route to school and kids can join. And he started doing that. And at the beginning, there were 2, 3, 4, 5 kids. But within half a year, I think it's now around 90% of all the kids at school join the bike bus. And actually, they want to wake up earlier in the morning, so they join because it's a celebration, it's fun, it's not negative or political at all. It's just offering the children this one day where they can experience. It's, again, with a complex term, it's called prefigurative politics. It's like doing the things that you can already do as if the world already changed. And not thinking, Kabul, probably distances are for many people already too large to completely bike. Then you can create hop-on points where you say, well, you have a specific school. You can create places 4 kilometers from the school at all the different directions where you can drop off your kid. And from there on, they go together to school, either by walking or cycling, and having a good time, basically. And then I think we know from all these examples that parents then start to shift their understanding of what good parenting is, because kids love it. So here we have this problem of, yeah, but what if it rains, right? If it rains, we need to bring the kid to school. Well, actually, children love rain. They love it. You think they don't, but they do. They love to jump in puddles and become completely soaked. You might not like it, but the kids really, really do. And as soon as you realize that by experiencing it, I think it does something to parents. Like, oh, wait a minute. And I think that's the way to go. We cannot just shift all these systems and it becomes sort of, whoa. But as an individual, most of us have the potential to go to a school of the children, to ask other parents, not about cars in this case, but to ask them, hey, would you like to, let's do it once a year at the opening of the school. Instead of having all these people in high vis patrolling around the school, you can turn it around and say, well, what if 4 or 5 parents are willing to guide the group? Let's do a group ride every now and then.
One piece of research I had seen is that for the battery size of one e-car, you could have 40 e-bikes. And I thought that was very interesting because what you're saying there about cars, and we can't convert all of the cars that we have into e-cars. You know, we can't go from petrol to electricity. But if you were to get maybe half of those cars to a bicycle, already you're using a lot fewer resources, a lot less lithium, and you're taking up much less space because it's spatially inefficient, a car.
I agree. So the geometry of a car just doesn't make a lot of sense. But this conversation will not convince anybody, because I think the only way on that front is to price it and to say, if you want to have such a big car, you need to pay a much bigger parking fee, for instance. If we want to have people become aware that they are actually a majority, this is not the way to go, because this is a known fact almost, right? So I think we should learn also to have the conversation much more about all the other elements that we are not losing but winning if we are shifting away from the car. And again, one clear thing that I think so many people rallied around in the 70s in the Netherlands as well, and what got people on the street was not resource efficiency or congestion solving solutions. It was really about stop murdering our children, stop paying our children a disservice. I think in Australia Australia, what I see, there's two huge pandemics, silent pandemics. One is the mental, physical, and social health of children. The other one is loneliness. So people are incredibly lonely and are using a lot of medical attention for that. There are millions of people that experience loneliness, and not only elderly, also young people are experiencing loneliness. So what if we shift the conversation to that and say what we are doing here is we are not optimizing the current mobility system, or we are not telling you that you do it wrong and we know better ways. That's part of it by pricing. But I think if you want to convince people why this is so important, we should talk about different things that are not related to our current conversation that you never hear on the radio when we talk about mobility. There's never a talk about how nice it was that you could play cricket with your neighbors when you were a small kid. And that's something we lost. I was on several radio calls when I was in Australia, and when it was about biking and cars and this conversation, the callers would be in generally angry men that were shouting at me that I need to go back to my own country. So I shouldn't come. It's a valid point. They saw me as coming from the Netherlands and telling the Australians that they needed to change their behavior, which is also a very problematic colonialistic approach that I didn't want to take. But then when I shifted the conversation to, it's not about that, it's about playing cricket on the street, the kids not being able to do that anymore, the whole tone of the conversation shifted. Very different people called in and said, oh my God, I never realized that sort of changed so rapidly. Because people see that their children are not happy. I don't know if you can find it online, but there was a great talk in Melbourne where I gave a talk about children's autonomy and mobility. And I told the organizer, it would be really weird if I talk about this and there are no children in the room. So can you please organize to have them? His name was Tom Taylor, 16-year-old. And he gave a spoken column about his life. And it's so powerful because he made this entire point. He said, look, I'm 16-year-old. I like to cycle, but all my friends think I'm weird. And I think they're right. Because in this system, I am weird. I cannot blame any of my friends for not cycling because I'm putting my life on the line every time I do it. And he addressed the room and said, this is what you are doing to my generation. Nobody should accept this anymore. We should stand. If I now remember it, I get goosebumps. It's such a strong story that touches our hearts, right? It's sort of, yes, everybody sees this. And this is not something that we ordered. Nobody wanted this. Nobody asked for this. Also not traffic engineers and everybody that's doing their best to improve the situation. Nobody thinks it's a good idea that our kids cannot go to basketball practice by themselves. So again, yes, it's important to talk about the limits of materials and energy and the fact that the system costs money and even climate, environmental issues. I think it's much more important for everybody that listens and wants some change to not have that conversation with your neighbor, but have the other conversation about how they feel about the freedom of their kids and how they would see that differently. And then again, the next step would be, can we experiment with it? Can we create a situation where at least once a month, the block where we live is changed and we can experience how it is if we have our barbecue on the street instead of in the garden. I hope that our book helps people to realize that's one of the biggest paradoxes of the book. The book is about mobility and traffic, but mobility and traffic for most people belong to the 5 most boring topics that they can think of. As what we want is to make people aware it shouldn't be like that. It's the problem that it became so technocratized because at the end it's about public space and how we use public space together, and it has been sort of hijacked by this very boring topic of traffic. But how do you sell a book about this topic to the people that need to read it, who are the people that are not interested in traffic? As soon as you put traffic on the cover, the people that need to read it are not picking up the book. And again, I think that's the trick also for everybody who listens, is don't mention the words traffic, cars, bikes, congestion, parking in the conversation at school, because then, it sort of shuts down and it limits our thinking to talk about public space, children, autonomy. So what's the opposite of loneliness? It's social cohesion or togetherness. That's cricket. That's what people are latching onto. And then we can talk, how do we get there? And obviously, there are some things in the current system that need to change. What I see also with politicians is they are willing, many more politicians than you think, are willing to defend the autonomy of children and are also then willing to say that there are steps that need to be taken. And those same politicians would not be willing to support paid parking or energy efficient modal shift from cars to bikes.
So last night, my friend and I got the train. She arrived in from Sydney. So I met her at the airport. We were just waiting for the train to come up here and sat next to a young woman. She's turning 16 and we got chatting, and she was also talking about getting a license and a car and everything. And I said, if most of your journeys are within 10 kilometers of home, you can get an e-bike and ride everywhere. And then you'll save $10,000 to $15,000 a year. And that never actually occurred to her. And she was just absolutely blown away by the idea idea. And it's true that, all her friends are going to go, well, you're just weird. And she was a bit worried about being stolen. So I said to get a really high quality D-lock. And then you can get insurance, which is a lot cheaper than getting a car. So yes, there's a cost, but it's a lot cheaper. And she just thought it was the best thing ever. It really changed her perspective on what was possible.
But I would assume almost that your friend was already willing to consider options. The most severe resistance we get from people that are not even there yet. So I think that it's an important element, the cost element and the efficiency, but to get people that are even much further along the line and are not willing or actually are seeing their current behavior as a right. There's a great book by Harald Welze, he's a German author, and it's called The Culture of Stopping. And he's making the point that in our society, we do not have good rituals to stop with certain things that we do. That is related to the fact that the things that we do are often much more loaded with identity and feeling than we often acknowledge. So then we talk about, hey, you can just leave your car. And in the case of your friend, it might actually be, I do not have a car yet, not even a license, so I can reconsider. But for people that already have it, you are touching a much deeper layer. And that's also where the resistance comes from, of identity and almost right to do so. And the example that Harald Welze gives is, let's say that for a very good reason, you have to destroy a church because it's in the way of something. You cannot just start demolishing the church. It will be outrage. But if you give the society the opportunity to desacralize the building through a ritual, then even that society is willing after that fact to see the church only as a brick building that needs to be demolished. So yes, there are people that are already there, but especially for the other people, we need to be aware that the discussion with them, we need to find better rituals or steps to take them towards. And again, I think why it's so important to talk about other things, because otherwise they feel that you're threatening something that's much more than just this physical object of 2,000 kilos. It is indeed often about the Australian way of life. I need to be able to take my barbecue and head to the beach, because even if I only do that once a year or maybe even never, that's the Australian way of life. Oh, okay, so you see me as this Dutch person that threatens something sacred. So I think we need to, first of all, realize that even that position is a minority position. The people that call to the radio to insult me are not a majority. They are a minority, and we need to continuously tell them this. It's a valid position, but it's a minority position. You're not representing all Australians. Even if you say you do, you don't. That's an important element. But the other element is if we want to activate the large silent majority, we need to step away from the technical conversation. And again, I think we shouldn't even use the forbidden words are bicycles, cars, e-cars, carbon emissions, congestion, parking, you name it. So there's the people, the minority position that keeps shouting, okay. But if you want to show them that there's a majority for change, we need to talk again about one thing that also probably in your case is already used, but is equal accessibility for all. Or one that I also really like is choice. Is people that say, oh, it's all about freedom. Okay, let's follow that reasoning then. Then real freedom is having real choices. Do people have real choices in Kabul? Do all people have real choices? People that have, for instance, that are not fully able to bike, they need cars. No, they need choices. Nobody's against that either. One of the things that we find out now in cities in the Netherlands, where also this change is really, really hard, is one of the things that we're not very good at is including all the people that also care about things that don't see themselves connected to our discussion about mobility. So there's a lot of people that worry about koalas, for instance. They should read a book about traffic. They should read movement. There's a lot of people worried about lack of green spaces. There's a lot of people worried about loneliness. There's a lot of people worried about children's autonomy. And all of them seem disconnected, but they all are connected to the question of how do we use public space to serve many different goals. And then you quickly come to the realization that that public space is currently used to serve only one goal. And that's not sustainable. Like literally, we cannot sustain that. That's something that I keep coming back to in this conversation. I know this, but also I think if I'm correct, you are called Kabul Car Free.
Yeah, so the town is called Caboolture. It's too long, so I just shortened it to Cabo, which is kind of the vernacular name for it.
Yeah, because one of the things that I always find funny too, so we have car low streets, and then also people are like, you cannot take away my car. And then I say, okay, but who's in favor of child low streets? Nobody. Oh, okay. So also I would challenge you at the end of this conversation to think about what would be a better name for the organization that would get more people behind it, because now it's sort of already creating almost the classical opposition that exists, but there are ways around it. Like one of the things that we did in the city of Haarlem is to include 10 different dimensions of the street, and then we approached all the organizations that are dealing with that. And we have created a manifest which is called The Just Street, and The Just Street was signed by more than 160 organizations, and one of them was the Dutch organizations for youth doctors. And they never realized that they had a stake in mobility discussions until they said, but we also are for a just street, which means that a street that can be used by everybody, also children. And even the topic of decreasing eye quality of children is connected to that, and they were not aware. I think as soon as you step away from the car and say it's about the street and the fact that it needs to be more just, it opens up this silent majority of people that care about this, that are not willing to step up against the car or car-free society. It's, I think, in the long run, a bit weird to define our future by the thing that is not there. I live in Ede, in the middle of the Netherlands, in a newly developed neighborhood, 1,300 houses. I'm an academic, so I walk around and I count things. And I walk around my neighborhood and I counted 0 helicopter platforms. Not a single house here has a helicopter platform. But nobody would call this neighborhood a helicopter-free neighborhood, because it's really weird to define the quality of a neighborhood by the thing that is not there. So I think that's sort of the trick, is to find qualities that people want to be connected to and then try them out. See, okay, what can we do? What small step can we make that is feasible, that can get people behind it? A temporary thing that centers around those qualities.
Yeah, I try and focus on getting around. That's most of my focus, but I just didn't know how to do it. So thank you. I will rethink definitely.
Maybe to help you, I would say this is, for me, it's a call to the listeners. So join in this brainstorm, because there's no easy answer. Otherwise, I would have given it. So join in the conversation to think about what could be qualities that more people could rally behind, that you can get your neighbors and parents, that even your uncle or family members that own a car, what would be a quality that they would all be able and willing to rally behind? Send them in.
All right, that's great. So we are going to wrap up here. Is there anything else you would like to say before we close out?
Well, maybe also realize how beautiful the place is where you live. That's coming from an outsider that was really happy to be there. There's always things to improve. We should enjoy also the places that we have and all the qualities that are there. That's one. And the second thing is that if you want to be part of change, I think embrace that process also as something fun and meaningful, and not as something frustrating or aggressive, because then you're not doing the right thing. I think it's probably also part of change that some people have to do that. But I think you can see this process of thinking along with fellow citizens, thinking about making changes. That's also why I really advise to do small things that sort of you can do and then gives you a good feeling, because it should also be fun and positive. That's the two things. Is realize how good it already is, enjoy that, and still enjoy also being part of making it even better.
Yeah, thank you very much. Skate Brisbane, they're on roller skates, and they got dressed in wedding dress. A group of them got together and they started just rolling around in Brisbane like that. And I thought, that's fantastic. I want to do something fun like that. That's absolutely what I want.
And maybe embrace the power of the koala.
Definitely, because they are actually endangered these days. So, well, thank you very much, Marco. I appreciate you coming during your holidays. Thank you for your work as well. And it's hugely important. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me, and all the best.
Thanks for enjoying Streets and People, presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. We publish our podcast regularly at the usual places and on our website, where you can find out more about us. getaroundcabocarfree.com.au. That's www.getaround, get around, that's pretty straightforward. Cabo, C-A-B-O, that's short for Caboolture. Car Free, C-A-R-F-R-E-E. There's no hyphen in that. .com.au. Our theme music is The Thief on AM Sound, which is just like our cars on our streets, always stealing the space. So let's stop that thief.